In the shadow of the American Civil War, long after the cannons fell silent, a different kind of darkness took root in the Appalachian highlands. The year was 1867, and the nation's wounds were still raw, but in the mist-shrouded hollows and along forgotten frontier roads, a story began to circulate in hushed tones. It was not a tale of uniformed armies or grand battles for the soul of a country. Instead, it was a far more intimate and terrifying narrative, one that spoke of a man named Jack Turner, who had learned to hunt not beasts of the forest, but other men. His legend, born from the lawless soil of Reconstruction, became a chilling testament to the ghosts that refused to be buried by history. If you are drawn to the echoes of these buried narratives and have only just found this archive, consider subscribing to ensure you do not miss the truths we unearth from the shadows of the past. The mountains of Appalachia in the years following the war were a world unto themselves, a realm of profound isolation that seemed to reject the very notion of a unified nation. They were ancient, wrinkled giants of granite and timber, their peaks perpetually wreathed in a low-hanging mist that clung to the dense forests like a shroud. This was not the pastoral, tamed wilderness of landscape paintings. It was a raw, unforgiving frontier where the natural world dictated the terms of existence with an unyielding authority. The very air here felt different, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, clean fragrance of pine. Light struggled to pierce the thick canopy, and when it did, it fell in dappled, shifting patterns upon the forest floor, creating a disorienting mosaic of light and shadow that could deceive the eye and trouble the mind. The silence was a physical presence, a deep and resonant quiet broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the mournful call of a distant bird, or the groan of ancient trees swaying in the wind. To live in such a place was to be shaped by it, to have one's spirit either hardened into resilience or worn down into a state of perpetual watchfulness. Travel was a formidable undertaking, a journey not of miles but of days, measured by the rising and falling of the Sunday. Roads were little more than rutted dirt tracks, often washed out by rain or blocked by fallen trees, snaking perilously along steep ridges and through dark, narrow valleys known locally as hollows. These hollows were the primary unit of civilization, isolated pockets of human life, where a handful of families might live for generations without seeing a soul from the next valley over, let alone a representative of any state or federal government. Law was a distant concept, an abstract idea that held little sway in a land where survival depended on one's own strength, cunning, and the temper of the seasons. The people of these mountains were insular and deeply suspicious of outsiders, their trust reserved for kin and their justice meted out according to unwritten codes that had been passed down through generations. They were a people who understood the secrets of the land because their very lives depended on it. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill, how to read the signs of an approaching storm in the behavior of the wind, and how to move through the dense woods without a sound. It was a knowledge born of intimacy and necessity, a literacy of the wilderness that was as vital as any written word. Into this fractured and isolated landscape, the end of the Civil War introduced a new and volatile element. The conflict had not been a distant affair for Appalachia. It had been a brutal and personal war fought not on grand battlefields, but in vicious skirmishes between neighbors and families who had chosen opposing sides. Loyalties were complex and shifting, with communities torn apart by allegiances to the Union or the Confederacy. With the official cessation of hostilities, the violence did not simply end, it festered, changing form and purpose. The formal armies disbanded, but the mountains became flooded with men who knew nothing but war, men who were hardened, desperate, and often armed. They returned not to a world of peace and reconstruction, but to a power vacuum, a lawless expanse where old grudges could be settled with impunity and new conflicts could ignite without warning. Guerrilla bands, which had terrorized the region during the war, simply transitioned into outlaw gangs, preying on isolated homesteads and vulnerable travelers. The authority of the federal government, preoccupied with the monumental task of reconstructing the South, barely extended into these remote highlands. Sheriffs and marshals were few and far between, their jurisdiction often ending at the edge of the nearest established town, leaving the vast wilderness to police itself. This was the world that created Jack Turner. His origins were as murky as the fog that settled in the valleys at dawn, a collection of whispers, rumors, and half-remembered tales told around low-burning fires. There was no official record of his birth, no family Bible with his name inscribed in careful script. He was said to have been born of the mountains themselves, a feral child who grew up in the deepest and most inaccessible parts of the wilderness. Some stories claimed he was the sole survivor of a family whose cabin had been raided during the war, left to be raised by the woods and its creatures. Others whispered that he was not entirely human, a product of some older, darker lineage tied to the ancient spirits of the land. The few who claimed to have known him in his youth spoke of a quiet, withdrawn boy with an unsettling intensity in his eyes. He rarely spoke, they said, but he saw everything. He possessed an almost preternatural understanding of the natural world, a skill for tracking that bordered on the uncanny. It was this singular talent that provided the one humanizing detail that clung to his name before it became synonymous with terror. He was known, in at least one hollow, for his ability to carve small, intricate figures of animals from pieces of scrap wood. He would leave them on the doorsteps of cabins where children lived, tiny, perfect effigies of deer, birds, and foxes, a silent and anonymous gift. It was a gesture of quiet creation that stood in stark, chilling contrast to the legacy of destruction he would later build. As he grew into a man, his reputation as a tracker solidified. He lived off the land, a solitary figure who moved through the mountains with the fluid grace of a predator. He dressed in buckskin and furs, his appearance so attuned to his surroundings that he could seem to vanish into the landscape at will. He knew every trail, every cave, every hidden spring and secret pass. He could read a broken twig or a disturbed patch of leaves like a page in a book, discerning the direction, speed, and even the state of mind of whatever had passed that way. Initially, his skills were sought for practical purposes. He could find lost livestock, locate game when food was scarce, or guide a traveler through the treacherous backwoods. People spoke of his abilities with a mixture of awe and apprehension. He was a tool to be used, a force of nature to be respected, but not someone to be understood or befriended. There was a coldness about him, an emotional distance that kept others at bay. He operated on his own terms, emerging from the forest when he was needed, and melting back into it when his task was done, leaving behind only payment and an unnerving sense of his profound otherness. The climate of post-war chaos provided a new and sinister market for Jack's unique talents. The Emancipation Proclamation and the subsequent Union victory had, in theory, granted freedom to millions of enslaved people. But freedom was a perilous concept in a nation still reeling from conflict. For countless newly freed African Americans, the journey north or to more protected territories was a desperate flight through hostile lands. They were pursued not only by former masters seeking to reclaim their property, but also by opportunistic gangs and bitter ex-Confederates who saw them as symbols of their defeat and a threat to the old social order. In the lawless borderlands of Appalachia, these fugitives were exceptionally vulnerable. They were strangers in a strange and unforgiving land, often with little knowledge of the wilderness and no allies to turn to for help. It was in this brutal context that Jack's reputation began its dark transformation. The whispers started to change. He was no longer just a tracker of lost animals or a guide through the mountains. He had begun to hunt people. It was never clear who first hired him for such a task. There was no written contract, no public advertisement of his services. The transactions were as quiet and secretive as the man himself. A deal struck in a shadowy corner of a town tavern or a hushed conversation on a remote trail. The word simply spread through the network of those who wished to see the old hierarchies violently maintained. A planter whose workforce had fled, a patrol leader wanting to make an example, a landowner who despised the presence of free black people in the territory. These were his new employers. They offered money, supplies, or simply the implicit promise of being left alone by the violent factions that held sway in the region. For them, Jack was the perfect instrument. He was local, which meant he would not draw the attention of federal authorities. He was discreet, ensuring that their involvement would remain a secret, and most importantly, he was brutally effective. He knew the mountains better than those who fled into them, and he pursued his quarry with a relentless, dispassionate patience that was more terrifying than overt cruelty. The stories of his hunts began to circulate, each one more chilling than the last. He did not lead posses or ride with gangs. He worked alone, a solitary hunter who preferred the silence and shadows of the deep woods. His methods were a terrifying fusion of his intimate knowledge of the wilderness and a cold, calculating understanding of human fear. He would not engage in a direct chase. Instead, he would shadow his targets for days, unseen and unheard, a phantom presence that preyed on their minds as much as their bodies. He would let them think they had escaped, allowing them a fleeting sense of hope and security before revealing his presence in some subtle, terrifying way. A misplaced stone on a path they had just cleared, the distant, deliberate snap of a twig in the dead of night, or one of his small, carved animals left in their path, a grotesque calling card that signaled their doom. He understood that exhaustion and terror were his greatest allies. By the time he finally chose to close in, his victims were often mentally broken, paralyzed by fear and the certainty of their impending capture. His emergence was a transition from a rumored figure of the backwoods to a very real and present danger, a predator who had found his true calling in the violent and broken world that the war had left in its wake. The mountains, once a symbol of refuge and untamed freedom, were becoming his personal hunting ground, and the whispers of his name were hardening into a legend built on the terror of those he pursued. The hunt was Jack Turner's art, a grim masterpiece painted across a canvas of fog-drenched forests and treacherous mountain passes. His knowledge of the wilderness was not the learned skill of an outdoorsman. It was an innate, primal literacy, as if the language of the earth itself flowed through his veins. He did not merely follow a trail, he inhabited it, becoming one with the subtle narrative of the forest floor. A single, misplaced stone could tell him of a person's haste. The depth of a footprint in the damp soil revealed not only weight but weariness, the slight drag of a heel betraying an exhaustion that was nearing its breaking point. He could discern the scent of human passage on the air, a faint trace of wood smoke or sweat that was imperceptible to any other nose, and follow it for miles through the densest thickets. The wind was his ally, carrying to him the hushed murmur of a distant conversation or the incautious snap of a twig that signaled the presence of those who did not belong. He moved with a silence that was itself a form of violence, a complete erasure of his own presence. His steps were measured and deliberate, his buckskin-clad form melting into the shifting patterns of light and shadow, making him less a man and more a disembodied intention moving through the trees. This profound connection to the natural world was the foundation of his terror, for he turned the very wilderness that offered refuge into a cage. For those fleeing bondage, the deep woods of Appalachia represented a daunting but tangible hope of freedom. It was a place to disappear, a labyrinth of green and granite where the authority of their former masters could not reach. But under Turner's shadow, this sanctuary became a theater of psychological torment. He was a patient predator, and he understood that the most effective weapon against his quarry was not his rifle, but their own minds. He would allow them to travel for days, letting a false sense of security take root. He would watch from a high ridge as they made a meager camp, their whispered plans for the future reaching him as faint echoes on the breeze. A man named Hezekiah, who had been a blacksmith, told his wife he dreamed of the sound of his own hammer striking his own anvil, a sound he had never been allowed to make for himself. Turner heard this, or something like it, and it meant nothing to him beyond the confirmation of his target's identity and location. He was an observer of hope only inasmuch as it was a vulnerability he could exploit. The brutality of his methods was not in overt, chaotic violence, but in his cold, systematic dismantling of his victim's will to survive. His ambushes were not sudden, frenzied attacks. They were meticulously orchestrated events, the culmination of a long and deliberate process of terror. The first sign of his presence would be subtle, something easily dismissed as a trick of the light or a product of an exhausted mind. A small, carved wooden bird, identical to the ones he once left for children, might appear on the path ahead, a grotesque perversion of a once innocent gesture. Then, the sounds of the forest would begin to turn against them. A call that mimicked a night owl would come from too close, its pattern just slightly unnatural. The rustle of leaves would seem to follow them, always just beyond the reach of their firelight. He made them feel constantly watched, turning every shadow into a potential threat and every gust of wind into a harbinger of his approach. He drove them to the edge of madness, forcing them to expend their precious energy on fear, making them clumsy, paranoid, and prone to mistakes. They would argue amongst themselves, their unity fracturing under the immense pressure of an unseen enemy. He was hunting their spirits long before he came for their bodies. When he finally chose to reveal himself, it was with the shocking suddenness of a lightning strike in a silent forest. He would emerge from the fog or the deep shadows of twilight, not as a charging aggressor, but as a calm, inevitable presence. The moment of confrontation was often eerfed quiet. There was no shouting, no prolonged struggle. He moved with a fluid economy of motion, his actions precise and final. The violence, when it came, was swift and devastatingly efficient, executed with the dispassionate air of a trapper dispatching an animal caught in his snare. He was not driven by rage or hatred. His was a colder, emptier motivation. He was a service provider, and this was merely the completion of his contract. Those he was paid to kill, he killed. Those he was paid to return, he bound with practiced skill, their spirits already broken by the preceding days of relentless psychological warfare. The survivors of his attacks, few as they were, spoke of his eyes. They said his gaze was flat and devoid of any recognizable human emotion, like looking into the eyes of a hawk just before it strikes. It was this chilling emptiness, this absolute absence of malice or mercy, that haunted them more than the memory of the violence itself. From these brutal encounters, the stories began to bleed out of the mountains and into the wider consciousness of the region. They were carried by the rare escapee who managed to slip through his net, a terrified soul whose fragmented, almost incoherent account would be whispered in freedmen's communities and sympathetic white homesteads. They were pieced together by hunters and travelers who stumbled upon the grim evidence of his work, an abandoned campsite with signs of a sudden violent struggle, a shallow, unmarked grave, or a body left where it fell as a stark warning to others who might attempt the same path to freedom. These tales spread like a contagion, passed from one person to another in hushed tones around a general store stove or over a fence line. Each telling embellished the last, Jack's skills becoming more supernatural, his cruelty more monstrous, his presence more spectral. He became a cautionary tale, a boogeyman used to enforce the new, unwritten laws of the post-war era. Parents in black communities would warn their children that if they wandered too far, Jack Turner would get them. He became a living piece of Appalachian folklore, a figure who blurred the line between man and myth. In some versions of the stories, he could command the animals of the forest to do his bidding, using crows as his spies and wolves as his hounds. In others, he could walk on the wind or make himself invisible at will. These fantastical elements, born of profound fear, served a very real purpose. They elevated him from a mere outlaw into an elemental force of nature, a personification of the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. He was no longer just a man, he was the spirit of the mountains themselves, turned malevolent and hostile. This mythology made him an incredibly effective tool of terror. The mere rumor that he was operating in a certain area was enough to paralyze communities with fear, to dissuade escapes, and to reinforce the brutal racial hierarchy that men like him were paid to uphold. The question of whether he was a lone actor or part of a larger system was, in a way, a false distinction. He was undoubtedly a solitary figure in his operations, a lone wolf who trusted no one and worked for his own gain, but his actions did not occur in a vacuum. He was a private contractor in the burgeoning, decentralized industry of racial terror. He was an independent tool, eagerly employed by a network of former slave owners, disgruntled ex-Confederates, and white supremacist groups who sought to maintain their power through violence and intimidation. He did not need to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan or any other formal organization to serve their goals. His effectiveness lay in his autonomy. He was deniable, a ghost who could not be tied directly to the gentleman who paid for his services. He was a symptom of the deep-seated sickness of the time, a manifestation of the violent resistance to the promise of freedom. His notoriety grew with each successful hunt, his name becoming a byword for the brutal realities that lay beneath the surface of Reconstruction. The transition was complete. The quiet boy who carved wooden animals had become a monster, his individual acts of violence coalescing into a legend that would cast a long, dark shadow over the mountains and hollows of a nation struggling to be reborn. The man named Jack Turner was a tangible threat, a physical danger that haunted the forested paths and remote hollows of Appalachia. But the story of Jack Turner became something far more powerful and insidious. It was a contagion of fear, a narrative that detached itself from the man of flesh and blood and took on a life of its own. It spread not through the wilderness, but through the arteries of human connection, the hushed conversations in town squares, the cautionary tales whispered to children by firelight, and the grim rumors exchanged between travelers at lonely crossroads. The legend became a tool of terror far more effective than any single man with a rifle could ever be, for a story could be everywhere at once, a ghost that required no sleep and could cross any mountain pass in the blink of an eye. It seeped into the very soil of the communities, poisoning the well of collective hope and fostering a deep, abiding dread that reshaped the patterns of daily life. In the small, isolated towns that dotted the Appalachian landscape, the tales of Turner were a form of oral currency, a dark folklore traded in low voices when the sun began to dip below the ridgeline. These were not grand, cohesive narratives, but a patchwork of fragmented accounts, eyewitness reports, and increasingly wild speculation. At the back of a general store, Sitting on pickle barrels and nail kegs, men would fall silent as a newcomer brought news from a neighboring county. He would speak of a freedman's cabin found empty, its door swinging on a single hinge, with nothing taken but the people themselves, and a single, crudely carved wooden fox left on the hearth. The storekeeper, a man named Silas who had a nervous habit of constantly wiping his hands on his apron, would claim he had heard from a circuit preacher that Turner had made a pact with dark forces in the woods, that he had traded his soul for the ability to know a man's sins just by looking at him. The story would then be taken home, retold with new embellishments, the carved fox becoming a symbol of the devil, the preacher's sermon a confirmed fact. The act of telling these stories was a ritual of shared fear. As twilight descended, casting long, distorted shadows across the dusty streets, a palpable change would come over these towns. The normal sounds of a community winding down for the day, the laughter of children, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, would be replaced by an unnerving quiet. Doors were bolted earlier and more securely. Heavy wooden shutters were drawn over windows, not just to keep out the night chill, but to block the gaze of whatever might be watching from the darkness. The town squares, centers of commerce and social life during the day, became abandoned, desolate spaces at dusk. The last rays of the sun would glint off the mica in the dirt roads, the air growing heavy and still, charged with a collective apprehension. A dog's sudden bark would make people jump. The rustle of leaves in the wind could sound like the soft tread of a moccasin. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential menace, and the vast, dark expanse of the surrounding forest felt like a malevolent entity, pressing in on the fragile circle of firelight and civilization. This constant, low-grade dread eroded the very fabric of communal trust. In a world where Turner was a known contractor, hired by those with power and malice, any stranger could be an informant, any neighbor a sympathizer. A freedman sharecropper might look at the white landowner whose fields he worked and wonder if a harsh word or a poor harvest would be enough to earn him a visit from the hunter. Within the black communities, suspicion could fall on anyone who seemed too prosperous, or who had dealings with the white establishment. Was their success earned, or was it the result of a terrible bargain, information traded for safety? The fear isolated families, turning them inward, making them wary of offering help to travelers or taking in strangers, for fear that they might be inviting the predator, or one of his spies, across their threshold. The social bonds that were essential for survival in such a harsh environment began to fray under the strain of this pervasive paranoia. As the stories grew, Turner's image began to transform. He was no longer merely a skilled and ruthless tracker. He was becoming a supernatural entity, a haint of the mountains. The tales imbued him with abilities that defied the laws of nature. It was said he could understand the speech of birds, who would tell him the location of his quarry. Some swore he could run with the speed of a deer and the silence of a cat, covering impossible distances in a single night. Others claimed he could not be killed by a normal bullet, that only a silver slug, molded with a prayer, could pierce his heart. These embellishments were not just the product of frightened imaginations. They were a way of trying to comprehend a level of cruelty and efficiency that seemed to defy ordinary human explanation. By turning him into a monster, a creature of folklore, people were attempting to place him in a recognizable category of evil. He became a figure akin to the raw heads and bloody bones of older tales, a boogeyman who embodied the deepest fears of the community. He was the darkness in the woods, given a name and a face. This mythologizing process answered the core question of his power. He was far more dangerous as a story than he ever could have been as a man. A man is finite. He can only be in one place at one time. He must eat, and he must sleep. He can be tracked, and he can be killed. But a story is infinite and immortal. The legend of Jack Turner could terrorize a family in a northern valley at the exact same moment it was forcing a community 100 miles to the south to bolt their doors. The threat of him was omnipresent. The landowner did not need to hire the actual Jack Turner. He only needed to invoke his name. He might mention to a group of his sharecroppers that he had heard Turner was in the area, that he was looking for work. The message, unspoken but perfectly clear, was that dissent or flight would have deadly consequences. The story became a leash, an invisible chain that bound people to their place through fear. It was a self-perpetuating system of control. The more people feared the legend, the more powerful the legend became, and the less the actual man needed to do to maintain his terrifying influence. The myth had become the weapon, and its shadow stretched from the highest peaks to the deepest, most isolated hollows, a constant and chilling reminder of the brutal new order that was being forged in the aftermath of the war. The dread was so complete, so suffocating, that it was only a matter of time before it reached a breaking point, when the terror he inspired would inevitably curdle into a desperate, defiant resolve to fight back. Fear, when it saturates the air for too long, can undergo a strange and volatile alchemy. For months, perhaps even years, it had been a paralytic agent, a cold weight that settled in the chests of those who lived under the shadow of Jack Turner's legend. It was a force of submission, encouraging silence and discouraging hope. But there is a point at which a soul can bend no further, a line in the dust of a cabin floor where the instinct for survival overwhelms the impulse to hide. The constant, gnawing dread began to curdle into something harder and more dangerous, a bitter, desperate resolve. The transition was not sudden, not a single, dramatic moment of rebellion. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the emotional climate, a hardening of the eyes in the freedmen settlements, and a quiet, grim tightening of the jaw among their few white allies. The stories that had once served only to terrify began to serve a new purpose. They were dissected, analyzed, and studied not as supernatural folklore, but as a tactical manual. The myth of Jack Turner, the monster, was slowly being replaced by an understanding of Jack Turner, the man. A man who, for all his skill, still had to eat, still had to sleep, and still bled when he was cut. The first stirrings of organized resistance took root in the very communities that had suffered the most. They were born in secret, in clandestine meetings held late at night in the back rooms of a church or deep within the woods, far from any prying eyes or listening ears. The gatherings were illuminated by the flickering, uncertain light of a single lantern, casting deep shadows on the faces of those who attended. These were not warriors or soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, preachers, and mothers. A man named Amos, a former slave who had purchased his own freedom years before the war and now owned a small, self-sufficient farm, became an unlikely leader. He was not a man of grand speeches or pronouncements. His power lay in his unshakable calm and his methodical, practical mind. He had seen too much of Turner's work, had taken in too many terrified souls who had barely escaped the hunter's grasp. He told the assembled group that they had two choices. They could continue to live as prey, starting at every shadow and praying the hunter did not come for them next, or they could learn to become hunters themselves. The idea was terrifying, but it was also electrifying. It was a reclamation of agency, a refusal to be defined as victims. Under Amos's guidance, they began to organize. They formed small, informal militias, not for offense, but for mutual defense. Men who had served in the Union Army, like a quiet but respected elder named Elias, were sought out for their knowledge of firearms and tactics. He taught the others how to load and fire a rifle efficiently, how to move through the woods in a coordinated fashion, and most importantly, how to think like a guerrilla. They learned to use the landscape, the same dense forests and narrow passes that Turner used, as their own weapon. They established a warning system, a network of signals using bird calls, strategically placed markers, or the rhythmic beating of a distant drum that could alert the scattered homesteads of an approaching threat. Sentries were posted, men and women who would sit for hours in the cold and the dark, their eyes scanning the tree line, their ears attuned to any sound that was out of place. The forest clearings that had once been places of fear, sites of potential ambush, were now illuminated by the determined firelight of these makeshift training grounds, the echo of their practice gunshots, a defiant answer to the silence that Turner had long commanded. Their new resolve was soon tested. The clashes, when they came, were not pitched battles, but sudden, brutal, and chaotic skirmishes. The first significant confrontation occurred near a place called Widow's Creek. Turner had been hired to retrieve a family of 4 who had taken refuge in a small, isolated cabin belonging to a sympathetic white settler, a man named Phineas who was a Quaker and a staunch abolitionist. Turner, accustomed to his quarry being scattered, terrified, and disorganized, approached the cabin with his usual predatory confidence. He moved through the undergrowth with an unnatural silence, his senses on high alert. But this time, something was different. He detected a discipline in the silence around the cabin, an unnatural stillness that put him on edge. The trap was sprung not by Turner, but on him. As he broke through the tree line, a volley of rifle fire erupted from concealed positions in the woods and from the windows of the cabin itself. The shots were not the panicked, scattered firing of frightened farmers. They were aimed and coordinated. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his buckskin jacket. Another splintered the stock of his rifle. He was forced to retreat, to melt back into the woods. The hunter, for the first time, feeling the sharp, unfamiliar sting of being the hunted. He escaped, but not without a cost. He left a trail of blood, a clear sign of his vulnerability. The news of this encounter spread like wildfire, igniting a spark of hope across the region. Turner was not a ghost. He was mortal. He could be fought, and he could be wounded. The incident at Widow's Creek emboldened the resistance. Other communities, hearing of their success, began to form their own defense groups. Alliances were forged between black settlements and a small number of white Appalachians who, for reasons of faith, conscience, or a deep-seated hatred of the old planter aristocracy, chose to stand with them. These were dangerous alliances, forged in the face of immense social pressure and the very real threat of violent reprisal from white supremacist groups. But they were powerful. They combined a deep, generational knowledge of the land with the tactical experience of former soldiers, creating a formidable and resilient opposition. Turner, for his part, was forced to adapt. He grew more cautious, more ruthless. He realized he was no longer hunting frightened, isolated individuals. He was facing a coordinated enemy. His attacks became more desperate, his violence more pronounced. He began to avoid direct confrontations, relying instead on arson and terror, attempting to burn out the communities that harbored his targets. But this shift in tactics only strengthened their resolve. Each burned-out cabin became a symbol of defiance, each act of violence a rallying cry. The balance of power in the mountains was beginning to shift. Turner's narrow escapes became more frequent, his legendary confidence eroded by the knowledge that any shadow could now hold an enemy, that any trail could lead to an ambush. The reign of fear that he had so carefully constructed was beginning to unravel, not because of the intervention of any formal law or government, but because of the courage of ordinary people who had decided that the price of freedom was worth fighting for, and that the monster who haunted their woods was, After all, only a man. The escalating conflict was building towards a final, inevitable confrontation, a turning point that would determine not only the fate of Jack Turner, but the future of the fragile peace in the Appalachian Highlands. The hunter's moon, which had for so long been Jack Turner's accomplice, now seemed to watch him with a cold, impartial eye. The wilderness that had once been his kingdom had become a hostile territory, its familiar shadows now laced with the potential for ambush, its silence no longer a cloak for his movements but a screen for the approach of his enemies. The network of resistance, once a scattered collection of desperate individuals, had coalesced into a determined and cohesive force. Their knowledge of the land was the equal of his own, their numbers were greater, and their cause had imbued them with a resolve that his solitary, mercenary existence could not match. His employers, the wealthy landowners, and bitter ex-Confederates who had once seen him as an invincible instrument of their will, began to distance themselves. He was becoming a liability, his escalating violence drawing unwanted attention, his repeated failures a sign of his waning power. The contracts became fewer, the payments less reliable. Jack Turner was becoming isolated, a man caught between the organized hatred of those he had terrorized and the calculated indifference of those he had served. His desperation manifested as a palpable recklessness, a departure from the cold, patient methodology that had been the hallmark of his terror. The patient, calculating predator was replaced by a cornered animal, lashing out with a ferocity born of fear. He took on a final contract, one that was whispered to be his most ambitious and his most foolish. A large group of families, more than a dozen men, women, and children, were making a coordinated exodus from the region, guided by a freedman preacher and protected by a handful of armed men led by Elias, the Union veteran. The reward for their capture, or their demise, was substantial, enough for Turner to disappear from Appalachia for good. It was a challenge to his authority, a direct affront to the legend he had built. He saw it as his last chance to reassert his dominance, to remind the mountains of who he was. He could not, or would not, see it for what it was, a deliberately laid trap. The final hunt was an inversion of all that had come before. This time, it was Turner who was being herded, his movements subtly and expertly manipulated by an enemy he consistently underestimated. Amos and Elias had studied his methods, learning to read his signs just as he had once read those of his victims. They knew his preferred terrain, his favored ambush spots, his patterns of movement. They led the column of families along a deliberately chosen route, a winding path through a series of narrow, steep-sided ravines in the Cumberland foothills. They made it appear as though they were seeking the most difficult and inaccessible terrain out of fear, but every step of their journey was a carefully calculated move, designed to draw Turner deeper into a territory of their choosing. They left signs of their passage, signs of weariness and disorganization that were just convincing enough to appeal to his ego, to his belief in their inherent inferiority. He saw a broken wagon wheel, a discarded child's doll, and the tracks of people struggling to move forward, and he interpreted these as signs of their impending collapse, not as the breadcrumbs of his own undoing. He followed them for 2 days, his confidence growing with every mile. He saw himself as the wolf, slowly and inexorably closing in on the scattered flock. He planned his final assault for a place known as Devil's Maw, a deep, narrow gorge with sheer rock walls, a natural choke point where the families would be at their most vulnerable. As dusk fell on the 3rd day, casting the ravine in a deep, purple-black shadow, he moved into position on the ridge above, his rifle resting on a rocky outcrop. He watched as the families made their camp below, the small flicker of their fire a fragile beacon of life in the immense darkness. He waited for the camp to settle, for the sentries to grow complacent, savoring the moment of his impending victory. But the attack never came from him. It came from behind. Amos and a dozen armed men had been shadowing him the entire time, using his own techniques of silent movement against him. He had been so focused on the prey in front of him that he had failed to realize he was being stalked himself. The confrontation was swift and brutal. A sudden rustle in the leaves behind him was his only warning. Before he could turn, he was overwhelmed. There was no grand duel, no final dramatic standoff. There was only the desperate, grunting struggle of a man fighting for his life against overwhelming odds. He was strong and feral, but he was outnumbered. He was disarmed, his rifle clattering onto the rocks. He was beaten into submission not with bullets, but with fists and rifle butts, a raw and personal form of justice. They bound his hands and feet and dragged him down into the very camp he had intended to destroy. The families he had been hunting gathered around him, their faces illuminated by the firelight, a silent circle of judgment. They looked at the man who had been the monster of their nightmares, and they saw not a demon or a supernatural being, but a bruised, bleeding, and defeated man, his eyes darting back and forth with a terror he had so often inspired in others. What happened next became the point at which history and legend diverge, two paths splitting off into the mists of folklore. The historical account, pieced together from fragmented records and the oral traditions of the families who were there, is stark and unadorned. There was no formal trial. The justice meted out in that ravine was the justice of the frontier, swift and absolute. He was given a final chance to speak, to say a prayer or offer a last word. He said nothing. He only stared into the faces around him with a look of pure, uncomprehending hatred. He was hanged from the branch of a great, ancient oak that grew at the mouth of the ravine, his body left to sway in the night wind as a warning to any who might follow in his footsteps. His reign of terror was over, his power broken, the man consumed by the violence he had lived by. But legend, as it so often does, offered a more gothic and enduring end. In the stories told for generations after, his end was not so simple. In one version, as his pursuers closed in, he chose his own fate, leaping from the highest cliff of the ravine and vanishing into the churning waters of the river below. His body was never found, leaving open the possibility that he had somehow survived, a ghost doomed to haunt the mountains forever. Another, more chilling tale, claims that his captors, wanting to ensure that his evil could never return to the world, sealed him alive inside an abandoned mine shaft deep in the mountains, rolling a massive boulder over the entrance. They say that on the coldest nights of the year, if you stand near that place, you can still hear the faint, desperate sound of a man scratching at the stone from deep within the earth. In both the historical account and the legendary versions, the outcome is the same. The hunter had become the hunted, his downfall a stark and brutal lesson in the mountain's capacity for justice. The man was gone, his physical threat eliminated. But the story, the fear, and the dark legacy he had carved into the very landscape of Appalachia were only just beginning their long, slow journey into myth. The death of a man is a finite event, a conclusion of flesh and bone, but the death of a myth is a far more complicated affair. Jack Turner, the man, met his end in a shadowed ravine, his physical presence erased from the world. But Jack Turner, the legend, did not die with him. Instead, freed from the constraints of a mortal body, the story of the hunter underwent its final and most enduring transformation. It shed the last vestiges of verifiable fact and ascended fully into the realm of folklore, becoming a permanent fixture in the haunted architecture of the Appalachian imagination. His name became a whisper on the wind, a chill in the autumn air, a cautionary tale that would be told and retold for generations, each telling polishing the myth and further obscuring the man buried beneath it. The end of his life was merely the beginning of his true legacy, a legacy of fear that would seep into the very soil and stones of the mountains he had once claimed as his own. His name became inextricably tied to the landscape itself. Certain places became his, forever marked by the memory of his deeds. The ancient oak tree at the mouth of Devil's Maw, where the historical record suggests he was hanged, became a place of profound dread. Locals would avoid it after dark, and travelers would hurry past, averting their eyes from its heavy, twisted branches. They said that on moonless nights, a shadowy figure could be seen hanging from the lowest bough, not limp and lifeless, but struggling silently, forever reliving his final moments. The abandoned mine shaft, the setting for his more gothic demise, became a site of pilgrimage for the morbidly curious. People would speak of a deep, inexplicable cold that emanated from its sealed entrance, even on the hottest summer days, and of a faint, rhythmic tapping that could be heard from deep within the earth if one pressed an ear to the cold, damp rock. His ghost was not confined to the place of his death. It was said to wander the high ridges and the fog-filled valleys he had used as his hunting grounds. Hunters would report the feeling of being watched, the unnerving sensation of unseen eyes following their every move. They would hear the snap of a twig behind them, only to turn and find nothing there but the deep, oppressive silence of the ancient woods. The small, carved wooden animals, once a curious and unsettling calling card, became objects of potent folklore. To find one on a doorstep or along a path was no longer just a sign of Turner's presence. It was a curse, an omen of misfortune to come. A farmer might find a perfectly carved wooden crow on his fence post, and within a week, his crops would fail, or his livestock would sicken and die. A mother might discover a tiny wooden fox on her windowsill, and soon after, her child would be struck with a fever that no mountain remedy could break. These objects, the last remnants of a humanity he had long since abandoned, became vessels for all the lingering fear and anxiety that his legend produced. They were tangible pieces of his myth, physical manifestations of his enduring evil that served to keep the story alive and immediate. The folklore provided an explanation for the unexplainable, a narrative for the random cruelties of a harsh and unforgiving world. In this new form, Turner was no longer just a hunter of men, he was a harbinger of all manner of suffering, a malevolent spirit woven into the fabric of daily life. Beyond the ghost stories and local superstitions, Turner's story carried a profound symbolic weight in the turbulent aftermath of the Civil War. He became a dark archetype, a personification of the brutal, unrepentant violence that sought to strangle the promise of emancipation at its birth. He was the ghost of slavery, a specter that refused to be exorcised by the signing of a proclamation or the victory of a Union army. His hunts were a continuation of the war by other means, a raw and intimate form of terror designed to enforce the old racial hierarchies that the conflict was supposed to have destroyed. In the official narrative of Reconstruction, the nation was healing, rebuilding, and moving toward a more perfect union. But the story of Jack Turner, passed down in the freedmen communities of Appalachia, told a different, far grimmer truth. It was a testament to the fact that for many, the end of slavery did not mean the beginning of freedom, but merely the start of a new and more treacherous struggle for survival in a world that was still profoundly hostile to their existence. He represented the deep-seated resistance to change, the violent lashing out of a defeated but not yet vanquished ideology. His legend also served as a powerful reflection on the nature of memory and justice in America. The official records of the era contain little, if any, mention of a man named Jack Turner. His crimes were not documented in court dockets or the reports of federal marshals. His history was written not in ink, but in the oral traditions of the marginalized, in the collective memory of the communities he terrorized. The folklore became a form of counter-history, a way of preserving a truth that the dominant culture sought to ignore or forget. It insisted that this violence had happened, that this man had been real, and that the fear he inspired had been a defining feature of the age. The story's survival was an act of defiance, a refusal to allow the victims of this brutal period of American history to be erased. It answered the question of why his story still matters, by demonstrating that the ghosts of the American past are not found in haunted houses, but in the unacknowledged histories and unresolved traumas that continue to shape the present. Ultimately, Jack Turner is a uniquely American Gothic figure. His horror is not derived from ancient castles, aristocratic vampires, or supernatural curses from a distant, feudal past. He was born of the American soil, a product of its specific and deep-rooted sins, the violence of the frontier, the legacy of chattel slavery, and the profound lawlessness that has often lurked just beneath the surface of the nation's founding ideals. The mist that clings to the Appalachian Mountains, the fog that obscures the abandoned cabins and overgrown graveyards, is the perfect metaphor for his place in history. He exists in that gray, indistinct space between documented fact and communal memory, a figure who is all the more haunting because of his verifiability. He reminds us that the darkest corners of the American experience are not always found in the realm of the fantastic, but in the very real histories of men who, driven by greed, hatred, or the simple, cold calculus of their trade, became monsters. His story is a chilling and vital piece of America's haunted past, a warning that the shadows of history are long and that the echoes of a hunter's footsteps can still be heard if one is willing to listen closely to the silence of the mountains. The file on Jack Turner is now sealed. We are grateful for your presence as this dark chapter of history was recounted. If you are new here, for more subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive to ensure you stand with us when the next record is opened, and leave a comment to share your thoughts on the legacy of the Appalachian hunter.